Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to run through an Arch Linux install, and there's just a couple things I want to mention up front before we get started. I am going to install this in a VM, so I won't be running into any hardware issues, and the most common ones you'll see is probably your Wi-Fi adapter, and if you're running on a desktop, or even if you have a laptop that has an NVIDIA card, you may see some problems there. I mean, there could be other problems, those are most common. We'll say that I installed this on one of my spare laptops recently and I didn't have to jump through any hoops. Just a basic firmware install took care of it for me, and I didn't have any Wi-Fi adapter issues. So one more upfront mention is that while I'm doing this in a VM, so I'll have a virtual NIC. If you are running a Wi-Fi adapter, I'll include a link to the instructions in the wiki that will help you configure that for your Wi-Fi adapter. Even then, which I'll get to this in the end, it won't be for Wi-Fi, but even with a regular Ethernet card, or if you're doing a VM with the virtual NIC, there's still some setup that has to be done for the reboot after the install to make sure that your network configuration is persistent. So we'll get to that later. So I'm going to go ahead and start up the virtual machine here. And so I'm just going to run through this for the most part, following the same steps in the wiki. I might gloss over a little bit of it, and in most cases, I'm just going to go with the most bare bones example, just to keep it simple. And so here to start, one of the first things is to set your key map. If US is not your default, I won't have to do anything here because that's what it defaults to. But if you do need to pick a different map, you can use locale ctl list-key maps. Everything's listed for you, and then you can do load keys and the name of your key map to set it. So another thing you might want to do is determine your boot mode. I'm going to guess that most of us are running UEFI, but you may have an older laptop or even desktop laying around that you want to install on that is running old school, so you might be using old school BIOS. So to check our boot mode, we can go ahead and check for the existence of and if the EFI directory exists, we know that we're booted in UEFI mode. And we can also check and see what we're running in as far as 32 or 64-bit. So let's go ahead. And we're running in 64. So just to run through some of the initial checklist things, I am on an Ethernet connection with a DHCP server on this network. So I'm not going to have any issues as far as my connection setup goes. Again, going back to Wi-Fi, you're going to have to connect to Wi-Fi, and that will involve using IWCTL. I'll include a link to the instructions there. You'll have to connect to the network with the passphrase after you scan for the network. And again, even though you've done that for the install, you're going to have to install some kind of network management service like Network Manager is what we'll be using here. And then you'll have to make sure that you're all set up as far as the SSID of the network and the passphrase so that you have persistent configuration post-install. And so since my connection is already set up, I just want to verify and make sure I have connection out. Check that, and we're good there. And then the next thing we want to verify is make sure that our clock is synced properly, which it should be since we have connection out. And that is the correct time UTC for me. So we're all set there. And so then we can move on to partitioning our disk. Again, this is going to be for UEFI. If you have BIOS and you're using MBR, you're going to have to check the wiki and follow that example. And here we're just going to go with ext4 and a pretty basic partition layout. So let's just go ahead and list out our disk. And there we go. We just have one 10 gig disk. So I'm going to go ahead and use GPT partitioner for that. I'm going to go ahead and hit new here, or N for new, I should say. We're just going to leave that as the default. And we're going to hit enter here to grab that first sector. And here we're going to do a size. So we're going to say +1G. That's going to be for our EFI boot partition. And our type code for that is EF00. And then we're going to hit N again for new. We're going to have that as 2. We're going to leave that as is. And then we're going to do +2E. This is going to be for our swap. And the code for that is 8200. Then we're going to do N again for a new partition. Go ahead and select 3 there. And then we're going to go ahead and enter here and enter there to use the rest of the disk. And we're going to leave that as the Linux file system type. Then we're going to go ahead and print and just check it over, make sure it looks good. And we have our 1 gig here for our EFI data. Then we have our swap. Then we have our system partition where we're going to install Arch. So I'm going to go ahead and hit W and hit enter for write. Hit yes to confirm. Okay, looks good. And of course, we can also just double check that again with an LSB. Okay. And yep, it looks like everything I wanted. So let's go ahead and get started with how we need to partition up our EFI. So that's going to be SDA1 for that one. And then we are going to go ahead and do our swap here. And then we're going to do our ext4. That's SDA3. And so now we're all set with our partitioning and setting up our file systems. And we did set up swap. I was just following through what the example layout was in the Arch wiki. You know, you can go and find debate when and why you should set up swap and how much and all that stuff in Linux. And maybe that's something I'll cover in detail in another video. In this instance, I just included it as part of the example. And so the next step here is we need to go ahead and get our disk, or I should say our partition mounted. So we need to mount our root partition where we're going to be installing Arch. So SDA3. And we're going to go ahead and just put it in MNT. Then we need to make a directory for our boot information. And we're going to mount our boot partition there. So in boot. And so at this point, we're ready to go ahead and do our base install. You can check the mirrors. The mirrors are in Etsy pacman.d mirror list. It's going to grab the mirrors that most recently synced, and then it's going to order those by the lowest ping or something like that in the priority list. I'm just going to leave it as it is for this one, but you may want to check that and pick something that is suitable for your location. So there are some suggestions in the wiki about installing some things with the base. And so one thing I'm not going to do is install microcode, because in this case, I am installing on a hypervisor. And so in order to deal with that, you actually update the microcode, or the hypervisor itself will have, you know, if you're using procs or, you know, VMware or whatever, should pull those microcode updates in as you update the hypervisor. So that's taken care of there. Now on your individual machine, if you're running Intel, you want to install the Intel microcode package. If you're running AMD, obviously install that one. And so more information and links are in the wiki about that. And by the way, I will include some links to specific things when I post this, so it will be in the description. Also, keep in mind that you can always install additional packages later. Here, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the set that I want to install as part of this demo, and I will go ahead and just run through and explain real quick. And right here with the packstrap-k, that is actually related to getting our Arch install going. And here we have the base. Obviously, the base package is linux-firmware. So we're going to go ahead and basically install the core of our system here with those. I'm going to include network manager here. So we have some network management software installed with it. I'm going to install the DHCP client with it. And then I'm going to make sure that we have our manual, and I'm going to do Vim so that we have an editor to configure a few things for our install. So I'm going to go ahead and fire that off, and that's probably going to take a little bit. So I'm going to come back once that's complete. All right, and now that's complete and we're all set with that. We're going to go ahead and pick up on the next step. So we're going to run gen fstab, and we're going to go ahead and generate that in our install. And we'll just take a quick check and make sure it's expected to. Yep, looks fine to me. Chroot treats the mount point that you specify as root, just like it sounds. You're changing root to that. So then when you run commands, it runs it in that context as if that directory that you've chose or that mount point is actually the target of the commands you're running here. So we'll go ahead and switch into that. Partition we set up for install was mounted at /mnt. So we're going to go ahead and chroot into that. And so there we go. Now the context has changed and it's going to treat that like it is root. The first things we want to do is set up our time zone. So we're going to do that with a link, soft link. And we're going to do that in zone info. And then from here, you'll have to pick your region and specific time zone. This is correct for you. And that's going to go to etc local time. And then we want to run this command. And then we need to do our localization settings. So that's going to be in locale.gen. And you're going to want to uncomment as appropriate for you. So in my case, I want right here. And so I'm going to quit the file there. And then from here, we're going to run locale-gen. And then we want to etc locale.com. And in here, you're going to want to set this appropriate for your language. For me, this is going to be in us.utf-8. And just a quick note, I'm using the default key map, which is US. And if you set something different specific to you, or you want to add additional key maps, you're going to have to set that. And I'll just paste that in real quick so that you see what it is. And so you'll want to set that appropriately for your key map if you're using something different than US. So let's go ahead and set the host name. set mine to that. And we'll want to set our root password here. And now we want to install our bootloader. So this is what we're going to need. Installed. And so here's the command to install into our boot directory here. So we'll go ahead and fire that off. And then last thing we need to do is actually generate the config for it. So all set there. Now, before we exit out of the chroot and reboot, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that network manager is enabled here. And so we'll exit out of chroot, reboot, and hope that our system comes up and that there are no issues. All right, no major issues. A couple minor things though is I forgot to install the OpenSSH server. Was not able to SSH in. You can always actually just run over the console and do that, but the console, as far as running the commands in there, it doesn't zoom as nicely, so it's not as easy to see. So I prefer to SSH in. So I did have to install that, and of course I created an account for myself because by default root login is not permitted over SSH. So those are a couple little fixes I had to make so that I could get in, but otherwise everything looks good, and we have our system installed here as we expected. And so now we have a basic Arch install, and we could add whatever packages we want as far as the tool set we want. And from there, we could add a window manager or desktop environment, whatever you want. And if you found this helpful or you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.